Welcome to episode 5 of the Pipeline Online Podcast. In this episode, we have former Alberta Energy Minister Sonya Savage. Savage has been at the heart of the pipeline debates, having worked with Enbridge prior to her time as minister. So there's a lot going on with the trade war with the United States, and a lot of people are talking about building pipelines to the coast. We'll talk about that and a whole lot more with my co-host Bronwyn Eyre, who is also a former Energy Minister for Saskatchewan. Oh, it is episode 5 of the Pipeline Online Podcast, and we've got Bronwyn Eyre, my co-host here, former Saskatchewan Energy Minister.
Hi, Brian.
So I understand you just got back from overseas, so got back to our frozen wasteland, I see.
Some interesting energy stories from over there, too. We'll have to get to those.
So we've got a lot on our plate today. I am very happy to introduce, a second here, Sonya Savage. And Ms. Savage here, I met her very briefly at a press conference in Regina a number of years ago. She was Energy Minister for Alberta. I'll get her to introduce herself. Her time very much was about the same time as Bronwyn was Minister in Saskatchewan. So Sonya, take it away.
Well, thank you for having me. And Bronwyn, it's so great to see you again. We did so much together during our overlapping time as Energy Ministers. So I'm really delighted to be here and happy to be talking about energy and the state of play in the energy sector again. I, of course, didn't run in the last election, and I'm parked myself as senior counsel at a law firm, Borden Ladner Gervais, sitting on a couple of boards, doing some advisory work. So energy is my heart, so I'm really happy to be participating in this today.
So what's very pertinent to our discussion is, can you talk a little bit about your prior experience with Enbridge and as minister?
Oh, yeah. So I'm one of those unique people who has spent the last 20 years in the pipeline sector, almost 20 years. I spent 9 years at Enbridge Pipelines, working on projects like the Northern Gateway, Alberta Clipper, Line 3 expansion, Line 9B. Spent 3.5 years at the Canadian Energy Pipeline Associations before I got talked into going into politics. Spent my time 4 years in politics as Minister of Energy, Minister of Environment and Parks, and a little bit of a stint as Minister of Justice and Solicitor General. So it's I'm able to see some of these issues from a very unique perspective, from very three-dimensional, from a legal perspective, political perspective, and having worked in the pipeline sector.
So Bronwyn, that sounds very familiar. First be Energy Minister, then you get to be Attorney General.
And it's so lovely to have you on, Sonya. Welcome. It's such a pleasure. And it's, feels like old times just to be in the same room, as it were, right? We fought the good fight. It certainly was a really intense time when we were overlapping as ministers, and so many things that we dealt with, which are now taking on, something of a different look, if you like, right? I mean, from the carbon tax to the pipeline discussion to energy security to all the federal policies, which are unfortunately, still with us. So anyway, we have a lot to unpack, and it's absolutely lovely to see you.
It's great.
So we're going to get into here. There's so much happening. Honest to God, I don't know day to day what to write about because, I was overwhelmed just with the whole carbon tax thing here. We'll get into that in a bit. But first of all, let's talk about Mark Carney's great adventure. Sonya.
Yeah, you mean his appearance overseas. I followed that pretty closely, and it was kind of a bit of a disaster for a press conference to get into a spat with CBC and with the media on international grounds about financial disclosure and conflict of interest back here in Canada. And I would just say a couple of things, and Bronwyn knows how important it is to disclose your financial assets and potential conflicts when you're in politics. I just don't know how Prime Minister Carney gets away with not disclosing his interests, his shares, his stock options, his interests in Brookfield in green investment funds. I don't know how he does not disclose that before the election, because there's a significant conflict there. Almost any policy or action he takes in the environmental sector will impact the value of those holdings, whether it's the earned interest that he'll have on from the capital funds, or whether it's the stock value, almost everything he could do in the environmental file, and especially the industrial carbon tax, can impact the value of those investments. So he not only should be disclosing it, but I think he honestly has to divest it. And Bronwyn's been there too and knows how important it is as a public office holder to divest your financial interests away from any decisions you could be making as a politician.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I just saw him. He was speaking in Iqaluit about an hour ago. And again, he got the question in French about why aren't you being more proactive about this? He misunderstood the question initially, started talking in more general terms, and then apologized and said he understood the question. And his answer more or less was, well, that's going to be up to the conflict commissioner, for whom I have the utmost respect, and so on. To which the CBC reporter said, well, why don't you act proactively and do this more proactively? The thing is in all of this, and I absolutely agree with you, Sonya, on the bad optics of those pressers in overseas, but it is funny to watch the Baudelarization of the whole thing, the kind of squelching, if you like, of the bad optics. It happened, but turn on the news, as I did last night, having landed, and you wouldn't really know that it had gone all that badly. And so it is an interesting effort afoot to put on the rose-colored glasses where he's concerned, I think. And I think that, obviously, in the election, we'll see what happens in terms of how much exposure some of this stuff gets. But I think there's a pretty concerted effort to minimize this because it's him.
Yeah, and so, I think it's one of the most serious conflicts of interest, potential conflicts of interest that I've seen. And you take, for instance, the industrial price on carbon. Of course, he's walked back the consumer carbon tax, but has said he wants to make the industrial price on carbon more stringent to get to emissions reductions faster. But the thing that's not lost on me, and I'm sure it's not lost on you, is the higher you make that industrial carbon tax go, probably the more profitable his carried interest in Brookfield investment funds and his stocks in Brookfield will become, because literally they're invested all over the world, all over Canada, in energy transition projects, which become more profitable with a higher price on carbon. And I say that as somebody who supports an industrial price on carbon and who supports the TIER program in Alberta. I just think it's a very dangerous path for Prime Minister Carney to be going down with potential conflicts.
So can I ask you, Bronwyn, here, can you perhaps explain, when we talk about the industrial carbon tax, most people aren't that familiar with it because they just see what they're paying at the gas pump. The industrial carbon tax is often referred to as the output-based pricing system. Is that not? Bronwyn, can you and Sonya please explain what that is and how it gets applied?
Well, Sonya, you go ahead on the tier side of it. There are different provinces have different approaches. And, in Saskatchewan recently, a couple of months ago, and I wrote about this for Pipeline Online, Brian, as you'll recall, Minister Wilkinson made an announcement, basically re-gifting Saskatchewan back its own money. There are a lot of their different layers to this and different funds into which, companies, certain tier of companies pay in, and that money is supposed to flow to the feds, which really kind of flows back to us we would like it to be much more about paying for things which we would like to determine. The feds certainly like to weigh in about the things that they would like on their agenda, and that's been a source of some conflict. But really, and Sonya, you go ahead. I mean, I think on the industrial carbon tax, interesting way that this is getting played out, I think, or will play out in the election, where you have the announcement yesterday by Pierre Poilievre about scrapping the industrial carbon tax. I wanted to ask you, bad policy, bad politics. What do you think about that? Because it's going to be a pretty clear divide, obviously, between the two of them. But first of all, go on, Tier.
It will, but and I think I definitely support Pierre Poilievre's move to scrap the industrial price on carbon and leave it to the provinces. Leave it to the provinces, and nobody in Canada should be should be concerned that provinces aren't taking action on emissions reduction. In Alberta, we've had an industrial price on carbon since 2007. It was the first jurisdiction in North America to bring a price on carbon, and I believe I heard the Premier Smith has said that the plan is to keep it in place. It works well. It lowers emissions, it recycles funds it receives into technology and innovation, but it's for the provinces, not the federal government. The federal government has used it as a means to regulate our industries, as a backdoor means to get into provincial jurisdictions. So to the extent that Pierre Poilievre will leave it to the provinces, I think that's smart. The concern with Mark Carney's direction is he's going to make that industrial price on carbon more stringent, more difficult. He will regulate it more profoundly to enter into our areas of jurisdiction. And I think that's created friction across the country in federal provincial relations for a long time. And I think it could get worse. And then compounded with a potential conflict of interest with his financial holdings, I think it's just a very serious place.
What I worry
wanted to get
about,
into,
sorry.
We actually have a huge number of topics here, and I do want to get going because we've already got 10 minutes into this. The big issue right now is Trump's trade war, and I do want to get into that. Before we start talking about that, just let people know watching online, if you comment either on LinkedIn, on Facebook, or on X, it will show up on here, and if you want to ask a question or make a comment, as long as you're not a jerk, I might feel like bringing it up and we can discuss it. So I do want to get into Trump's trade war. He has been bringing in tariff after tariff, first 25% on everything. And then, well, maybe not, maybe it is. And it's, 10% on oil and gas and energy. Well, and then he's bringing in another 25% on steel. And I mean, I don't want to get into all of that so much as, the United States is really beating us down. It is really hurting us. And, it could get a lot worse. What are your thoughts on that, Sonya?
Well, the chaos being created out of the United States is disrespectful and hurtful. It's upsetting Canadians. It's creating uncertainty on both sides of the border. It's slowing investment. It's disrupting supply chains. But there's a number of different schools of thought on what is his end game. And I don't think anybody really fully knows, but some say and originally it was about the borders and fentanyl. I think most of people have moved on from that's not what it's about. Others think it's to onshore, bring back manufacturing to the United States. Some feel it's to strengthen the position for CUSMA bargaining, for the renegotiation. And others feel he really is looking for tariffs as a way to raise revenue and be able to lower income taxes and income and corporate taxes in the United States. But others, and what
Sorry, did we lose you there? Hello? Sorry, did we lose Sonya? Bronwyn, are you still there?
I'm still here. Might just be a Wi-Fi thing or something.
Okay, hold on a second here. Sonya, you might have to log out, log in again. This is the first time this has happened.
Yeah, it happens. These things happen. I think that Sonya makes a really, an interesting point. I think that it's such a combination of unknowns, right? That it's a combination of all the things she has cited that basically come into play. There you are.
They're back. Yeah, an unstable internet connection. It's crazy. I have the fastest Wi-Fi there is, but
that's the first time that's ever happened.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So we're talking about the Trump's trade war. Before I get into it, Bronwyn, what did you think his motivations are?
Well, as I say, I think it's a combination of everything that Sonya's talked about. I think it's impossible to know exactly what's at the root of it all, as the art of the deal or psychological warfare or chaos theory or whatever you want to call it. I think, though, that it is about a recalibration of relationships. And I think there's a certain feeling of, from his perspective, that things are out of whack. when it comes to fundamentals such as defense, when it comes to fundamentals, yes, such as, fentanyl and the border more broadly, NATO, just what the nature of an ally means. And I think a certain amount of getting money back, in every sense too. I think, going back to the Carney side of this, I find it intriguing. Again, the psychology of this from a reporting perspective, if you like. We have the 100% tariff from China, which if you were just sort of watching the proverbial mainstream, you would hardly know had happened. It's a completely different take on wrapping ourselves in the flag when it comes to Carney and Trump versus farmers and China, which I find interesting. And it's partly why I raised that thing with, previously, Sonya, about Poilievre, because of course I agree with you. I'm completely in support of, provincial autonomy and the provincial funds and provincial approach. Where do we even get started? The non-constitutionality of the feds weighing in on all this stuff. But it is interesting how it can be played. And I think from a political perspective, that's of some concern, or could be of some concern, where it's going to be, Poilievre seen to be anti-climate versus Carney, who seem to be pro-climate. And the way it plays out, there's a lot of detail there. It's whether Poilievre actually gets a chance to present the nuance and the detail.
So I want to get into why I think that Trump's doing this. And Sonya, if you think I'm out to lunch, please tell me this. I hope I'm wrong, but I think that Trump is motivated by ego more than anything. He's now the most powerful man in the world. How do you get put on Mount Rushmore? Well, the people on there are the guy who created the country, the guy who doubled the size of a country, Jefferson, the guy who saved the country, the guy who built the Panama Canal. Well, if you double the size of the United States, he mentioned very early after he was inaugurated about changing the borders of the United States. Hasn't happened in 70 or 80 years. If he absorbs Canada, it is the biggest thing in the history books since World War II. And, maybe I'm wrong on this, but I really think that he is going to try to hurt us economically until we are driven into a depression likes of 1931, 15-20% unemployment. And I think that, and a reporter asked him about this, I think that will push Canada to pull out its biggest stick in this fight, which is going to Gretna, Manitoba. And I'm going to show the picture here. And turning off the taps. And that's the biggest thing that we can do. This is where the Golden Weld was at, where the Enbridge main line crosses the international border. And if we do that, I suspect that Premier Smith will call a referendum for sovereignty the next day. And the second Alberta goes, Saskatchewan will follow. So if you think I'm out to lunch, or where do you think on that, Ms. Savage?
Well, I think it's certainly a lot of the hype up in Canada that with talk that Trump wants to annex us. But I'm just back from a week down in the United States at Sarah Week, the kind of the Olympics of the energy sector and the business interests in the United States. And it certainly was not the talk down there. And it was largely brushed off. The talk of annexation was largely brushed off as being unrealistic and not serious. And that's who Trump is. He was taunting us, creating chaos at a time when we're renegotiating tariffs. We saw his talk on Greenland, his talk about creating the Riviera and the Gaza Strip. So he says a lot of outrageous things. And in the United States, they're just saying that's just unrealistic. It's not going to happen. But let me point out another issue in Canada on why some would have an interest in hyping it up, and it's what it's doing to politics up here. I just read in the paper here, and it's Bob Ray was on a rant on the weekend playing up how serious he thought the threat of annexation was. And the last paragraph of the article showed and stated how that was impacting public opinion. Well, guess what? Is impacting public opinion up here. It's scaring people. It's creating an enemy outside of Canada just at the time we're heading into a federal election. And guess who it's helping? It's helping the
Absolutely.
Liberals, so that there's no talk anymore, little talk about the record of the Liberals over the last 10 years, how they've actually weakened our country, how they've put us in a position over the last 10 years where we don't have alternate markets, where our economy is in a very poor state, how we can't build major infrastructure projects. So it's a classic thing that happens in politics. You create an outside enemy, you create an emergency, you scare people. And I think a little bit of that is going on here. And that doesn't mean to say that we shouldn't be outraged at the things Donald Trump is saying and mad and angry. It's disrespectful and insulting. But I think we would be much better off to just try to get down to the problems, try to protect our interests in the trade negotiation. We should be spending time advocating and making our case to reasonable people in the United States on why trade and free trade has worked so well and how it works on both sides of the border. We should be advocating, building bridges, not creating chaos and enemies. But look, we have a federal election coming, and it's going to get wilder up here before it gets better. And I can see Bronwyn wants to jump in on this too.
No, I completely agree. I mean, we've fallen absolutely into the psychological trap, and I mean, whatever motivates him. And I've just been overseas. The Europeans are super mad at him as well. The Brits, everyone's mad, and I mean, whether Greenland really serves its purpose, if you like, in the sense that is it worth a discussion on some of these issues, the border, the free trade agreement, fentanyl, tariffs, whether we've, coasted on the coattails defense-wise of the states forever. All of those things are worthy of some discussion. They have focused us enormously, very, very quickly, including overseas. And as I say, are there defense holes in the Arctic? Yes. Does that relate potentially to something like a Greenland discussion? Potentially, yes. And we see Prime Minister Carney this morning admitting as much, that the North needs buttressing. So a lot of these things, as I say, have focused us very quickly. But that said, the silence on the Chinese tariffs, the way it's being presented suddenly on pro-environment, anti-environment, all of this is just serving is falling into place, as you say, Sonya, in terms of helping one party, which is the Liberal Party, and that everyone should be very concerned about based on their record.
Well, and it is sowing chaos across the country, regional tensions playing out as Premier Ford brought in export tariffs on electricity and threatened to ban the exports. Of course, that came back to our provinces, Saskatchewan and Alberta, and our premiers said absolutely not. So I don't think for a minute that the United States doesn't know of the chaos this creates in Canada and the disunity it sows. But just on to the threat of a federal export ban or export tariffs on oil and gas, it's that architecture is still in place. The architecture of the National Energy Program still exists in the Energy Administration Act and in some elements of the Canadian Energy Regulator Act to impose it. So it's there. The only thing that's stopping it from being a live issue right now is an order in council from 1982, right. I think it was, or 84. That could be lifted. But that is nuclear. That is dangerous. If a federal government did that, that would probably be the most ill-advised, dumb thing that the country could ever do. The dumbest thing next to vetoing Northern Gateway Pipeline. But it would bring about the effects that Brian mentioned. Like both our provinces would be extremely hot under the collar. So I would hope and trust that doesn't happen, but we should, I'm following it closely because the tools are there.
So that kind of opens up a comment here from Jay Rydell, who's the mayor of a small hamlet outside of Estevan. He was one of the people who was on the streets in Ottawa protesting back in 2019, and again with the truckers convoy. And he asks, why has Canada never built a national trade corridor so we do not have to rely on 75% of our commodities going to the United States? Now, the reason I wanted to bring that up there, I think it's very pertinent because it was on my list of things to talk about, is that I've heard more people talking about building Northern Gateway and Energy East, and we'll tackle those one at a time here. than I have in years. And I've noted before, I was probably the last reporter that I know of who is still bugging Premier Mo's and, Energy East should have been a thing, right? This is like the last few years. Everyone else forgot about it. But the reality is that there's been more talk about that right now. And the companies behind them are not saying, well, let's build Northern Gateway. They're not saying, let's build Energy East. So I want to start off first with, let's tackle Northern Gateway. You spent a lot of time on that.
Spent
And
9 years.
so obviously those plans are there. They're on a shelf or in a box or on a hard drive or something like that. Number one, is it possible to go dig that stuff up and dust it off and refresh it a little bit and say, here's a project. Maybe you want to upscale it to 42 inches instead of, I think, the 24 was planned or 36. Is there any possibility of that? And is Enbridge actually doing that?
Well, I mean, there's certainly volumes of material, 4 years of information that went into a regulatory process in the National Energy Board with environmental assessments, engineering reports. All of that is still there. It would have to be, it would be out of date, it would have to be updated. But I don't think pipeline companies have been burnt so badly by trying to build major infrastructure, whether it was TransCanada with KXL and Energy East, Enbridge with Gateway, Kinder Morgan ended up selling off Trans Mountain. Like, nobody's going to step forward and put their hands up to say, I want to build a major export pipeline right now, not with the type of politics we have and uncertainty in Canada, and not with the regulatory system that we have in play right now. It's just not going to materialize. But doesn't mean we can't do it. We're going to have governments that step in to make it happen. It doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. And I think to the point of the viewer, that it's energy corridors, I think, are going to be a big part of it. Not just a pipeline, but an energy corridor where you can have LNG and you can have natural gas and oil. You can have fiber optics. You can have all sorts of exports within an east-west energy corridor.
And there are so many things there. I mean, as to why. I mean, if only magic could happen, right? I mean, you have the issue with any national corridor of Quebec, which has said that they don't want Western Canadian oil. There are, as Sonya says, of course, these are private companies which finally have to make private business decisions, and the investment is so massive, and they've been burnt, as she says, so badly repetitively. I mean, look at Northern Gateway, how close it could have been. There were issues, though, with hereditary chiefs versus other First Nations communities in BC who ran afoul of each other. There was infighting that way. Any pipeline project which has to get going again has to go through that. And of course, because it crosses borders, you run into Bill C-69, which, that's one of the things that I thought we might talk about today. I mean, certainly for Sonya and me,
that's how we first met.
Very, very large. Yes, we did. And there's been nothing that Prime Minister Carney has said vis-a-vis, as far as I know, about everything from C-69 to C-59, which we're going to talk about, and down the list. So he's just, treading water and all this stuff, because the fundamentals will be presumably in place. And it makes any kind of energy corridor or dusting off plans for old projects extremely challenging in Canada. Unless we did, this is an energy emergency, a la Trump, or what he's unleashing in Alaska, or the cutting of red tape that he's doing, anything close to that. I mean, a national emergency on, peace, order, and good government, which was used by the federal government for the carbon tax, until you have a complete change of opinion and approach to these things from a federal perspective,
100%.
It's not going to happen. Not going to happen.
I have the map here for Northern Gateway up, and I did want to talk about this a little bit before we move on, because you have worked specifically on Northern Gateway personally. Is that the right of way for Coastal GasLink? Is it different? Is it the same? If we wanted to do Northern Gateway Mark II, could we just parallel the Coastal GasLink thing, because they've established a new right of way? It's been done. Can that be done?
I think it's a bit different right of way. It would be a very similar right of way as you're heading into Kitimat. into the where the Douglas Channel is and where the export terminals would be. It's similar, but it would be different. And I think using existing right-of-ways definitely makes it simpler, but I don't think it solves all the problems. I think there's huge changes needed to the regulatory process, and you need to find a way to get politics out of the way. And you have to get political consensus up front and get to a yes politically up front, and that includes Indigenous groups. And then get politics out of the way and say a yes always means a yes. But it certainly helps if you're using existing right of ways. It doesn't solve all the issues.
So let's switch over to Energy East, because I think you were involved with part of us here. If you look on the map on the very left-hand side where it shows the orange part from Hardisty. Now, one of the things that I wondered that when you were in government, if this was part of the thinking, and maybe it was, maybe it wasn't, when Alberta financed its portion of what was supposed to be the Keystone XL pipeline, and you actually built it, put it in the ground all the way to Empress. If Keystone wouldn't work out, could that pipe, sorry, wrong map, could that pipe be reused to at least do the initial portion from Hardisty to the Saskatchewan border? And then, the idea was to use an existing pipe from there all the way to Kingston, which had been 2/3 of the way, and then build new pipe to New Brunswick. Would that have been possible?
It certainly helps, again, when you have existing right-of-ways, but then you still have the problem of getting across Quebec. And so you still have some significant issues. And again, to build a major infrastructure project like that, you're going to have government involvement to backstop it in some way, or to certainly de-risk it in some manner. You're going to have to get politics out of the way. And make sure that there's a consensus right across the country that you're going to build this. And the regulatory process under Bill C-69, as Bronwyn knows so well, just it does not work. And even when you get a project approval, it still does not work because it takes forever to build permits. And that's why you saw so many delays. Part of the reason you saw so many delays on building Trans Mountain is they couldn't get permits. It's like the whole system is broken and needs to be fixed.
Yeah, and there's no talk about that, in this all this talk about the new heir apparent and Carney. I mean, I think the thing about Bill C-69 on the politics side, and again, will we ever see a time when politics are not part of this regulatory structure now? Who knows? Regulatory approval process. We hope, but the main thing was the inconsistency. Well, one of the biggest things about it was the inconsistency, right? I mean, so we've talked about, the heat pump issue over the last, year or so, where, Maritime's exempted on the home heating oil, but not, other parts of the country on other things. Similarly with C-69, was no problem, getting the approval on the offshore, in off the coast of Newfoundland, or at least much less of a problem, much more streamlined, made all kinds of excuses as to why that one was better than, other approvals out west. I mean, that just fundamentally demoralizes the energy companies from further investment. You see that, within a federation. If you were a big company now, big energy company wanting to dust off those plans that you speak of, Brian, I mean, would you? It's just so challenging.
It's impossible. There needs to be 100% pivot or 180-degree pivot from the policies that the Liberals have brought in the last 10 years. We're seeing that pivot in the United States as they're getting serious about energy dominance. Yeah. We're going to have to see a similar pivot in Canada if we want to be able to increase production and find alternate export markets.
And I noticed, I'll just say really quickly, Brian, when I was in the UK, even the Labour government under Starmer is sort of reading the room in terms of turbocharging the economy. They're doing environmental red tape cuts, including protecting, I love this one, bat communities that developers have had to follow. They're lessening the red tape on that one. But also environmental permits will be dropped for parts of major infrastructure permits deemed to carry a low risk or deemed to be necessary. And there will be one energy regulator rather than multiple. multiple entities. So again, completely different landscape in the UK in terms of, an Energy East, obviously, type structure, but even they are getting the fact that if you're going to do anything now, you need at least to streamline the process. We are so far from that. It's crazy.
We've got a comment here from a LinkedIn user. It says, would it be justified to enact some sort of energy emergency? Trump declares an emergency on everything every second day to get regulatory approvals in place to build new pipelines. Now, I often wondered, through order of council, couldn't they have forced Energy East and Northern Gateway?
It's a little complicated because we have a duty to consult. We have constitutional rights for Indigenous groups, so it gets a little bit complicated. But you know what? There's precedent in Canada on how to get major infrastructure projects done, and we have, going back to the late 1970s, we have the Northern Pipeline Act. We still have the Northern Pipeline Administrator, a position that exists in the federal government. And what that was standalone legislation that said there will be a pipeline built from northern Canada to take natural gas down from the Alaska natural gas through Canada and through Alberta to connect into the system to go into the United States. And that was standalone legislation saying, we're going to do this subject to the technical and environmental assessment. So we do have precedents to do that, but we would have to, so you can dust that off and take a look at an NPA type process or standalone legislation that would give the upfront political sign off. You'd still have to go through environmental assessments and Indigenous consultation, but that's the easy part. The hard part is the politics.
Yeah.
And but yeah, I think there's some merit in dusting off what's worked in the past. You don't have to call an emergency. You can look at some precedents of things we already have on the legislative books.
And keep in mind that the federal government called the carbon tax an emergency. I mean, it was basically, they brought that to the Supreme Court based on peace, order, and good government, as in a national emergency. So if you had a completely different mindset and you felt that this was constitutive of a national emergency, an energy emergency, there are lots of things you could think to do. It's certainly not going to happen with the current government, and I fear the current prime minister, the new prime minister.
So I wanted to get into, I had it up here on the screen a minute ago here. Both Premier Moe and Premier Smith Premier Smith's been doing this for a while, and Premier Moe since October, been talking about essentially doubling their oil production, which for Alberta would be nearly going from 4.5 million to about 9 million. Saskatchewan, they're talking about going from 450,000 barrels to roughly 1 million. Now, no time frames have I heard been given on that. But what would it take? I mean, from my perspective, having written about this for 17 years and having built pipelines, if you double production, you're going to have to double the takeaway capacity. That means literally every pipe you've already got in the ground of Keystone, of the Enbridge Mainline, of Trans Mountain, all these would essentially either have to be doubled or new pipelines similar to that to other export, perhaps Energy East, perhaps Churchill. We would have to double the entire infrastructure. Is that possible?
Well, you know what? We doubled the infrastructure between 2005 and 2015. The pipeline takeaway capacity doubled during that time period. Now you're starting from a lower base. There's no reason, physically why you couldn't double it again. It will take time. There's supply chain issues, there's regulatory issues, but we doubled it once, and we could double it again. That would require pipelines going in every direction, north, south, east, west. But it's possible. Is it probable? It'll take a long time. But I know that the Premier has there's at times she said it's double production. More recently, she said another 2 million barrels per day. So either way, it's a lot more capacity. We've got existing lines that aren't fully optimized that could move more barrels. We've got existing right of ways that could be used, pipelines that could be reversed. But yeah, it'll be be a massive undertaking to be able to support doubling production. Doesn't mean it can't be done.
The reason I keep showing this image here is this is the construction of Enbridge Line 1 back in, I think it was 59 or something like that. And then 49, sorry. 49. And then this is Line 3 replacement going through southern Saskatchewan, and I think it was 18. And a bunch of other these are Line 3 replacements. So I mean, the difference is, and you take a look at this hardware, and this is one of the things that drives me nuts, because the original Trans Mountain was from start to finish to operating was 16 months. And the second one, and it was built with equipment like this, where they hardly even had hydraulics. They didn't have GPS, they didn't have computers, they didn't have any of that modern stuff. And then you go to this sort of technology, and it took to build TMX, it took 4 years. Line 3 took forever. One of the things that really drives me batty, and maybe both you can speak to this, is that because of the Migratory Birds Act, since basically 2000, we have not been allowed to build major pipelines during the summer, which is the most instructive time to do it, because a little birdie might have built a nest on there, but if a farmer runs his tractor over right away, it's no big deal. I mean, he'll kill every single thing on that right away, but if a pipeliner does it, it is the end of the world. Hummingbird flew across the Trans Mountain line, they shut it down.
Yeah, it sounds like the British bats thing. That's why I raised it, right? But one of the things I was going to ask you about vis-a-vis that, the oil production and the doubling question, Sonya. So you said, obviously, you were at Eyre, and you told me and Brian before we got on today that, there was a huge change in mood, and, because we've both been, and it was a different deal a few years ago. And so that I found hopeful, right? More production, talk about increasing things and output and change of outlook and the rest. But one thing you did mention was that, according to Chairman of Occidental, to Trump supporter Harold Hamm, production will not grow, you said, was, in terms of your recap of Eyre, because he had said he sees declining reservoirs, higher costs. And I thought that was relevant to to our talk too about Saskatchewan and Alberta, and just getting oil and product to places. What do you make of that comment about declining reservoirs, higher costs?
Yeah, and sort of one of the themes that pervaded the entire Eyre week was energy dominance. President Trump's desire to have energy dominance, to drill, baby, drill. And to bring on more production, to be less reliant on imports, U.S. importing oil. And what I took away from that is that it's not likely going to happen in the United States for a variety of reasons. We had a couple of the company's CEOs saying, look, it's the reservoirs, the tier 1 inventory is declining. The reservoirs that we've been drilling in are more expensive to pull out less oil. They're starting to decline. Costs are higher. Companies are wanting to give back shareholder value in terms of dividends, and that there's just not the will to increase production right now. So that, to me, gave a very big opening, and to filling. If the U.S. wants to be energy dominant, they're going to need oil and gas from Canada. Mm-hmm. And that helps with Saskatchewan and Alberta's goal to double production, but they can't increase production to the extent that they want to themselves. They're going to need to import it. And it's just a market reality, and a reality of the production they have in the US. Whereas here in Canada, we have virtually unlimited production coming out of the oil sands. We have the fourth largest reserves of oil on the planet, and the production is low risk because they're large manufacturing facilities in the oil sands, and they can produce at low risk. In natural gas, we just found our reserves in Alberta are 6 times larger than we thought. So we've got the supply. We can help the United States with energy dominance. But yeah, there was an overall sense it's not going to happen in the United States.
So Sonya has 10 different points. We just go over one of them for Eyre Week. We're going to break for 30 seconds here and come back for a sponsor from Grime Sales and Service, and then we're going to hit the other 9 points in Eyre Week. If you have comments, please post them up, and we'll be back in a second. There's a reason the HG Jack has dominated Saskatchewan's oil patch. That's because that distinctive curved walking beam reduces energy consumption by about 25%. That means 25% less power bills, 25% less carbon tax. That's a big difference. And it's available exclusively from Grimes Sales and Service, Batman, Saskatchewan. And we're back. On your points here, and folks, I'm going to be posting this here probably tomorrow as an op-ed, so that you can actually see what Ms. Savage put up here for what she gathered from CERAWeek. CERAWeek, as you mentioned, is the big deal. I mean, we had Premier Moe down there, Colleen Young, Saskatchewan's energy minister, I believe Premier Smith was there. Was Brian? I think Brian Jean was there as well.
He was, yeah.
Okay, so let's go down your points here. So we hit energy dominance. Next one was climate and energy transition.
Yeah, and I think there was, it really felt, and I've been to CERAWeek several times prior in industry as a government minister, and twice now since I've left politics, and the themes are different every time, but this seemed like a 180-degree pivot from 2024 between the Biden administration and the Trump administration. And just to give you an example, in 2024, there was an LNG pause in place. There was no further LNG export facilities allowed in the United States. And the mood there was pretty damp. And it was all about climate change. How fast is the energy transition? How fast and where is the rollout of the IRA, net zero plans, energy transition projects? That switched this time. And in fact, Energy Secretary Chris Wright was on stage, and he said right out that I think he called it the ill-advised climate policies of the Biden administration. The American people were collateral damage to that, with the impact of higher energy prices, low economic performance, and unreliable energy. So that's as a 180-degree pivot as I've ever seen. And the whole program and seemed to reflect that, with CEO after CEO. They were still committed to climate change and still committed to reducing emissions, but they were certainly a lot more confident to talk about their core business of energy production.
So you touched on this a little bit for oil, but one of the things I'm seeing more and more is that the whole idea of American production just climbing without end. I think it sounds like the tier 1 properties in the Permian Basin, which is where Landman is based, is petering out. I mean, we saw the tier 1 peter out in the Bakken already, so now they're moving to tier 2, tier 3. And it looks like we may possibly see another peak of American oil production, unless they figure something else out technologically. You mentioned Harold Hamm, who was very active in the Bakken. Was there any other discussion about that?
Well, there's certainly Occidental and Continental, Occidental, ConocoPhillips were all, for one reason or another, they were saying we're not going to see massive increases in production. But I think it's also a factor of returning value to shareholders. It's more expensive to get the same amount out now, and therefore to even maintain production at the same level in the United States requires more capital. So they'll have to spend more to even maintain production. To grow production, they'd have to spend a whole lot more, and there didn't seem to be an appetite for that.
Is there any, in terms of that, Sonya, just any more, I mean, I assume there is, but red tape to cut? And if there were more federal red tape, environmental and otherwise, would that help the bottom line cost-wise for these companies?
In the U.S.?
Yeah, in the U.S.
Well, they're cutting red tape like crazy down there. And it's EPA, EPA rules, any sort of red tape is being cut. And I don't think that's necessarily the issue. That'll help with building out the grid and the
Mm-hmm.
electricity,
Mm-hmm.
and it'll help with data center developments in natural gas. I don't know if it'll help grow production.
And just one other thing on that Alaska, what Trump has signaled on Alaska, sort of unleashing, production and so on in Alaska. What is the take on that, at Sierra and otherwise? Is that going to make any kind of difference? Not enough? Just where does that fit into the broader picture?
I think it'll make some difference, but remember, as they increase natural gas in Alaska, it's probably not coming into the U.S. markets. It's going to be exported as LNG, which still means they're going to likely need to import a lot of Canadian gas into the lower 49.
So I wanted to touch here a little bit. We got 71 people watching live right now. Folks, if you make a comment on whatever format you're watching, we can actually bring it up like this. Comment from Edward Callio saying the Bakken growth is constrained by natural gas takeaway capacity. There's lots of tier 1 growth available, same as the Permian. So if you have questions or comments, throw them in. We're still going to be here probably for another half hour or so. So there is time to discuss this as we're working through these points. You just mentioned natural gas. Was there anything else you wanted to say about natural gas here, Sonya?
Well, down at Sierra Week, natural gas was king. Like, it was, if there was anything that the takeaway theme from Sierra Week was about, or it was natural gas. The increased use of natural gas for data centers, AI and data centers, for power generation, the importance of natural gas in geopolitics. It was a huge story on natural gas down at Sierra Week.
I imagine the Europeans are kind of desperate for every single load that they can get.
Some days they are, but they talk a different game sometimes.
Yeah. So I got a long question here. Just give me a second. It's coming from LinkedIn, talking about climate change and carbon reduction. What metric can be used, put in place measures to measure the effects of any changes that we implement? Unlike any other tax-funded initiatives, such as building of infrastructure, there doesn't seem to be a measurable outcome for all the net zero initiative types. Is it perhaps time to redefine net zero and set new objectives, keeping things like energy security as a priority?
That sounds like Alberta's climate plan that we brought in when I was environment minister, and Alberta set an aspirational goal of net zero, saying it is possible, but there's a lot of things that are outside of our control to know what timeline. Cost, technology, the ability to deploy capital, all of those things make it very difficult to ever set a date for a target. But the other thing that I think we're seeing played out across the world right now, and hopefully in Canada, is just this whole notion that for the last decade, particularly in Canada, lesser so in the United States, that we've had a climate policy. And everything has been absorbed into the climate policy. Everything falls under the umbrella of climate policy. That's export strategy, energy policy, industrial policy, all had to fit in under climate policy. And we've seen that just doesn't work. It's important to have climate policy, but it's every bit as important to have energy security policy and industrial and export policy. And that's been that's got to be changed.
Yeah, it's trumped economic policy, right? I mean, so I think that's what our commentator is getting at. I mean, that's the huge problem. Plus, I mean, just the data, and you've alluded to this. I mean, when even the federal goals that have been set can't be met, and the data to get to that point is complex at best to determine. And as we recall, Sonya, not often shared or not fully shared with provinces.
Yeah, never.
So they'll say, do your methane, cap it out, but they'll only give you a little part of the puzzle in terms of how they're even setting their own numbers for us
with
to
your
follow.
data.
It's an absolute nightmare. And it goes back to our point about how you need it streamlined. You need, one entity, one set of rules. They have to be fully shared, fully transparent. And then, of course, you have the issue about leakage, right? I mean, that every, other countries around the world have different sets of rules or aren't following ours or other ones. And it just becomes a very experimental exercise, right?
Well, that ties into the comment just came in here. How much oil is imported by Quebec and from where? And tankers coming into Montreal and that sort of thing. Do any of those have net zero policies for those countries?
Not from Venezuela and Saudi necessarily. I mean, they import a lot from there. They always have. I always go back on Quebec, and Sonya, you weigh in too. I mean, I know there was a poll when we were ministers. Regular people in Quebec were completely happy to have Western Canadian oil. And I forget the exact numbers, but it was very positive, and we both referred to it a number of times. I mean, it was more governmental policy, the politics of it again, that somehow our oil was dirty, but it was, look the other way when it comes to countries which have, no real plan, and it just becomes a question of, as I say, being willfully blind about where they're importing from. I mean, they do indirectly via Enbridge. I guess it's line 9.
Line 9B.
Right. And so again, when there was suddenly talk about maybe the U.S. turning that off, everyone got a little antsy.
Yeah, they always do. Nobody had a problem with in Eastern Canada with the concept of export bans until it was pointed out that an export ban of oil from Canada would mean that you would not get oil into Eastern Canada. That's just the whole conversation over the last 10 years has became like that. But it was interesting, and it was certainly something to be enthusiastic about. But the Angus Reid poll from about 3 weeks ago that showed the appetite across the country for coastal pipelines showed it was either 74% or 76% in Quebec supported, and the same in British Columbia. I never saw those types of numbers in the 19 years that I've been working in the pipeline sector. I never saw that kind of numbers and kind of support for building pipelines. Point. It simply wasn't there.
Yeah. Excellent.
So I'm sorry, I don't agree that net zero is ever going to be possible. I do think, and I hate to call you both out on this, I think politicians who say we can reach this, I'm sorry, I don't think thermodynamics and laws of physics will ever allow it, but maybe that's just the engineering flunk out in me that is thinking that. I do want to get back to the 0 week things. We have a few more points you had. Next one was critical minerals, Sonya.
Yeah, well, I think for the very first time that I've ever seen on the agenda at 0 week, critical minerals came into the agenda, and I think that plays really well for Saskatchewan and Alberta, with uranium in Saskatchewan, with lithium in Alberta, and it's really become a geopolitical conversation on the need for critical minerals. And that's because over the last 10 years, or at least the last decade, China has been working on this, and they've wrapped up all the supply chains from resource extraction to mineral processing to manufacturing to batteries and defense applications. They're a decade ahead of us. And so that becomes not only an economic security issue, it becomes a national security issue and a military issue, because these minerals are used for military applications. So critical minerals was pretty high in the agenda for 0 week for the first time ever.
Well, we're drilling for lithium here, just west of Estevan. I've done a lot of video work for Arizona Lithium, and they're looking to go into commercial production by the end of this year.
Same in Alberta. E3 lithium in Alberta.
I think we're going to beat you, though. I think they're going to beat out E3, and they don't have giant federal money unlike E3 does. So,
well, the main thing on developing, and this goes back to the tariffs and North American markets, is to develop and to be able to develop those projects on lithium and other critical minerals. You need an offtake agreement. You need somebody who wants to buy it. It's not like drilling for oil and gas, and if you have the product, it will sell in the market. Because you're developing a new markets, new product, you need an offtake agreement. So that offtake agreement is going to come from the United States. You need huge capital investments to be able to finance it, and that's all going to come from the United States. So when Canada talks about wanting to have a critical mineral strategy, they're going to have to look south to be able to make that happen.
So the next topic you had on your list was geopolitics. Now, I mean, obviously, that has everything to do with the Russian invasion, the fact that Europe no longer looks to Europe or to Russia for its energy security, and someone, not sure who, perhaps the United States, blew up a pipeline in the Baltic Sea. So, how does geopolitics fit into what happened at CERAWeek?
Yeah, so geopolitics came in, and of course Dan Jurgen, who leads CERAWeek, is probably the most informed person there is in energy security and geopolitics. He was an advisor to, I think, 5 different U.S. presidents from both sides, Democrat and Republican, over many, many years. He's written books, so it naturally becomes a big part of the CERAWeek agenda. So in 2022, it was all about the Russian invasion of Ukraine and how do you weed out those molecules and barrels of Russian product. This year, that was still in the dialogue, but there was a different flavor and trend to what geopolitics means, and entering into it was more a conversation as well about the new world order, disorder, some would call it, and how trade is realigning, how Trump is really creating a little bit of chaos in world geopolitics, but also on how geopolitics is now transactional. That's President Trump likes to make deals, and how it's become nationalistic and protectionist. That's the tariffs. So these conversations were all entered in there, and a lot of conversation on Europe and how Europe had is now practically deindustrializing because their energy is too expensive. Their policies haven't been conducive to having energy affordability and reliability or security, and they're in trouble.
Well, and I mean, speaking of geopolitics, I mean, it was actually Trump. He mentioned it last week, I think, when the Irish Prime Minister came calling. Those sessions are always must see. But anyway, he referred.
Too bad that wasn't yesterday on St. Patty's Day.
Everyone looked a little nervous after what had happened the week before the Oval Office meeting, but he did point out or remind everyone, of course, of his warning of Angela Merkel, in his first term about why are you getting all your energy from, or so much of it, almost a majority of it, from Russia, and they walked into that, and Germany is highly vulnerable now. Yeah. As a result of those geopolitical decisions, which are very inconvenient truths. And so, I mean, this has been a long time coming in a lot of ways. I think also on the geopolitical side, Canada to the US, I mean, I found it interesting going back to our original discussion about some of the inconvenient truths about where we find ourselves in terms of energy and defense and other dependencies. When Ford went down to the US, it was heralded as, it was sort of full steam ahead. He's gonna knock everyone's socks off, pulling all this electricity out of the loop. And it went suddenly very, very quiet. And I thought it was interesting that apparently Trump said, if you do this, I'm going to sort of unleash historic ramifications on you. And that was sort of suddenly went super, super quiet. Again, I think this whole geopolitical discussion would be it would be helpful if there could be a fuller discussion around some of it, even around Europe. Everyone forgets about the oil and gas thing from Russia. And I think that we have to have a very much more open, sort of broad discussion around some of these positions that have been taken that have led us to this point.
100%. The problem is politics enters into all of it. And, there's a lot of, whether it's in Europe, whether it's in Canada, when mistakes have been made that have created energy security problems, the responsible party for it certainly doesn't want to admit that. And we don't find the ability to create policies to fix the problem that was created.
Yeah. You're on mute, Brian.
Yeah, we can't hear you, Brian.
Sorry about that. I turned that off so you don't hear me drinking from my coffee. This comment here actually goes back earlier in our discussion, but I think it's appropriate to what you're just talking about. The Bloc Québécois would never let a pipeline go through Quebec. I loved hearing Jean Chrétien speak just before the coronation of Mark Carney, saying that there should be a natural gas pipeline from Alberta to Quebec. I mean, I wanted to bring that up earlier, but I mean, the reality is that if Energy Saguenay had been built, or it was under construction right now and nearing completion. If Energy East had been built, we Canadians could be playing a part in helping out our European allies in this whole geopolitical thing of taking them off of the Russian supply. We'd also be making some money which wouldn't hurt, especially for the Alberta coffers more than anyone else.
Shame he didn't say that when, all these years he's had, Justin on speed dial, presumably. I mean, Saguenay, it was a Quebec decision, but it was also a federal decision, or at least was led to by some of the problems with 69, which led Warren Buffett to walk away and so on. I mean, they have only themselves to blame.
It's a tragedy too. Another tragedy.
One of the things you both talked about for Europe and whatnot about deindustrialization, Sonya, you mentioned, and Bronwyn, you just got back from Europe there. One of the things I've seen show up numerous times is a graph which shows the cost of energy and how rich a country is. There's no such thing as a rich industrial country that has high energy costs. You have to have low energy costs to be rich and industrial. And when industrial costs went up in Germany because of this, all this happening, as you said, they've been deindustrializing. I think it's BASF is moving their primary facility from Germany to Louisiana to take advantage of Louisiana natural gas. Is that correct?
Yeah, sort of similar to how Mark Carney's former company Brookfield moved their head office to the United States. Companies will make decisions based on what's best for their shareholder. They have a fiduciary responsibility to take decisions for their shareholders.
Well, and Douglas Thompson here, who's a regular contributor, he first started out as a young man working offshore in the North Sea as a rig hand, and he's worked his way up to a company man, and he works right now in Saudi Arabia. And he points out that, England, again, is cutting off its nose by its face. And you're looking at the deindustrialization of England. I mean, they've shut down coal. They're shutting down their oil industry, and soon they will not be in the country that led the Industrial Revolution is deindustrializing.
I was so deeply disappointed by Boris Johnson and his pivot as he made his way through that time as PM. And I've been reading more about it in recent weeks. I mean, he was more left in a lot of ways on this kind of stuff than even Starmer is signaling. He's going to be getting rid of red tape, supposedly at any rate, or turbocharging. He went the other way. And he set it back. Absolutely. I mean, one country in all of this, which is interesting, and absolutely take your point on the UK. I mean, Norway is an interesting one because of the fact that they kind of play it both ways. They've been very, very skillful at it, very Machiavellian in the sense that they're so green, but they're also building more pipeline than ever before, and so on. I mean, it's an interesting one to analyze in terms of that. Sonya, any insight on that in terms of where things are at currently? I know that was one I was intrigued by when we were in our old jobs.
Yeah, it goes back to something I said earlier, that this is what happens when your climate policy is an umbrella over every other policy, that everything else you do needs to fit into your climate policy. And if you've picked targets for dates that are unrealistic, unaffordable, unachievable, you don't have the technology, you haven't thought through energy security, then you're just going to fail on every level. You're not going to meet your climate targets, but you're also going to impact your economy and your standard of living. And in the end, that's going to cause major disruptions with your population. And they're not going to buy into any climate policies if they look at them and say, this is making my life completely unaffordable. So we just have to get back to that more balanced conversation of balancing the importance of taking climate action, but also energy security, reliability, affordability, your industrial strategy. And I see some optimism that maybe we're having a more balanced conversation on all of those things now than certainly we were 6 months ago, but only time will tell.
Well, I actually had the opportunity to meet Liz Truss when she was in Calgary here back in late January, and I got a chance to speak to her one-on-one, and plus she did a speech to the conference I was attending. And, she wanted to restore some semblance of reality to the UK's energy policy, and she wanted to open up fracking and get back in the North Sea and drill and be energy independent. And her reward for that was she was the shortest term prime minister of English history, and they punted her. And oh, by the way, who was the Bank of England guy who caused a lot of her issues? It happened to be Mark Carney. I do want to get to the next topic here of artificial intelligence, Sonya.
Yeah. So to go back to the conversation at CERAWeek, artificial intelligence AI first came onto the agenda as a topic last year in 2024, and it was, nobody really knew a whole lot of it, but all of the different companies are using it in their operations. It's making them more efficient, but also, and probably more importantly, is the AI data centers that are being built. And that's seen as kind of a geopolitical race to beat China, to having data centers and AI, and they require enormous amounts of electricity. So where are you going to get the electricity? Well, it's natural gas. Nuclear is coming later on. Nuclear is a big option, but data centers was really, it entered into every single topic down at CERAWeek, from geopolitics to natural gas, nuclear power, to the ability of the grid to serve the people, to serve residential and commercial consumers, as well as energy transition, and how will it impact where the globe is going and trying to get with lowering emissions. So it was really dominant on the agenda.
So and it's interesting because I know Kevin O'Leary's talked about this in terms of trying to attract AI data centers to Alberta, and that's really an interesting side part of all of this. But one of the things that he and others have pointed out is how sketchy the power grid really is in the US, and how unreliable it is in many ways, how tapped out it is in many ways, and how ununiform it is, right? And we should be extremely proud of the fact that we have a much more uniform, harmonized, solid, stable grid up here, and so can be very well poised for these data centers, right? I mean, we're very, very, and so that's an interesting one. Also that Chrystia Freeland, I know, and others in the Liberal government had talked previously about AI data centers being powered by green energy, which
that's not going to happen.
Never going to happen.
And and that was so clear down at CERAWeek. They have to have guaranteed 24/7 reliable power, or they lose it. Like there is no ifs, ands, or buts. They have to have power that's there 24/7, and they have to back up that 24/7 power with diesel or something. They can't factor in for a single minute that the data center power goes down. So this is a conversation about natural gas and nuclear if you want to power data centers. And that's why I think we're so well suited in Canada to position some of these data centers up here with natural gas. And if they want it clean energy, we can couple it with carbon sequestration, CCUS.
Well, I wanted to ask you there. When Bronwyn was saying, it's like, I gotta get this out there. How many people at CERAWeek were saying we're going to build these, $1 billion data centers, and we're going to power it by wind turbines that, oh, by the way, Alberta's built over 1,700, and I've reported on times where the entire fleet of 1,722 turbines were producing zero power, or the fact that solar, we're just going to turn off the data center when the sun goes down at 7 p.m.
Nobody was talking about running. I mean, wind and solar would be an important part of it, like where they can get green power. They're anxious to have it, but they need guaranteed backstop with natural gas or nuclear.
So, and you just touched on the low carbon part here about carbon capture. Can you touch about what was discussed on low carbon there?
Well, there was still a fairly significant agenda at 2025 CERAWeek on low carbon forms of energy and energy transition. I think it was slightly smaller than it was in previous years, and it could be because the program on oil and gas was significantly larger. But I think there was, and throughout the whole conference, there was an acknowledgement that climate change is a problem that needs to be addressed and solved, and lowering emissions needs to happen and will happen. But at a pace and scale that's more realistic. So there wasn't as much impact on stage and in the sessions on low carbon energy, but there's still a significant amount of conversation around carbon capture and around biofuels, sustainable aviation fuel, that sort of thing.
So, Bronwyn, was there anything you want to say on low carbon energy, Bronwyn?
No, I don't think so. I think, I mean, not that we haven't touched on. I think that I think that it's interesting the change in tone that we're seeing, right? I mean, not only at Eyre, but obviously across the board, and I think that's just goes without saying. I mean, we're seeing a complete change, but on the other hand, federally, actually probably much less of a change than anyone is actually really realizing. If as we go into this election and depending on the outcome, I think that we have to watch very carefully about where Carney is actually coming from on some of these things, and how a lot of it's just not going to be very different than what we're seeing right now.
So you touched on this earlier, Sonya, but in your points, you did have Canada-U.S. relations and tariffs. And with respect to CERAWeek, you mentioned a little bit more, but is there anything else you wanted to say about that?
Well, I just go back to the point that the conversation down at CERAWeek was kind of brushing off the perceived threat of annexation and the talk of the 51st state. It was largely brushed off as being unrealistic, implausible, unserious, more as taunting. They don't really understand why we're so anxious about it, because they don't see it as a real thing. But they do. While a lot of the sessions didn't focus on tariffs and it wasn't a large part of the agenda, there was an overall consensus that tariffs were creating a lot of uncertainty, supply chain disruption. Investment was maybe paused because you don't know what's happening next, and a sense that tariffs are really disruptive of the economy. And of course, last week during CERAWeek, the stock market was pretty dismal, and it was crashing almost every day.
The next point you had here, just to wrap up on the CERAWeek, was the overall mood of what you heard.
Yeah, it seemed like it was optimistic. Certainly optimistic from U.S. companies that they had, that there was an agenda for energy dominance, that some of the deregulation was moving forward. The previous year, there was a LNG export ban on, which was really dampening the mood of the whole conference. So I would say that the mood was optimistic from the energy sector perspective. There was a sense that energy production, energy security, reliability, affordability was now being able to be discussed alongside of climate change, not subsumed by climate change. So it's an overall sense of optimism.
So can you, I'm sure you've probably had a chance to check some of these out. Can you perhaps describe a little bit the American LNG capacity versus ours? Because 15 years ago, there was no export capacity for LNG in the United States. And I spent an unhealthy amount of time on Google Earth checking these things out. And you can use the time ability to go back to see the development. And if you look at Sabine Pass, I think they're on their 6th train now. And just across the river, there's another one there. And then there's down at Corpus Christi, and all along the coast there into Louisiana and Texas. There's so many LNG facilities that dwarf what we're building at Kitimat, and versus we still haven't got one online yet. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, well, in fact, down at CERAWeek, there was another $18 billion LNG facility announced by Louisiana and Secretary Wright in the state of Louisiana. So they're building like crazy down there. Now, remember, some Canadian gas actually gets exported off of those LNG facilities in the Gulf of America, not the Gulf of Mexico, but of the Gulf of America, that Canadian gas is being exported. And really what kind of the hope is, and the discussion and acknowledgement is Canadian gas can backfill the US demands while US gas is being exported. Like, it's a interconnected market in North America with pipeline systems. Like, we are really an interconnected market. So the more the US exports, the more Canadian gas will need to go down into that market. So there's some optimism there, but there's also the need to develop, obviously, to develop alternate markets to protect from trade, from tariffs and other risks associated with having only one market.
So I guess one of the things that I want to wrap up Zero Week here, but carry on with that thought, is one of the people I correspond with on occasion is Michael Binion from Questerre Energy. I'm pretty sure you know him. Michael, a number of years ago, leased something like 1 million acres in the
Quebec.
In Quebec, and found a whole bunch of natural gas. Figures he could supply a third of Quebec just from the gas on his acreage. And yet Quebec will not allow him to frack, so we cannot develop it. They say they don't want pipelines. We've had a number of comments about that on here. And so they are getting the equalization from fracked gas in northern Alberta. So they're getting the benefits of it, just not having to have it in their backyard. And as energy minister for 3 or 4 years there, I mean, what are your thoughts on that, Sonya? And Bronwyn, I want to hear your thoughts on that too.
Well, I could never understand that, because our natural gas and our energy products here in Alberta provide royalties. They provide a source of revenue for the province to be able to fund health and education and everything else that creates jobs. I don't understand why a province wouldn't want to be like that, wouldn't want to develop their energy sources. It makes no sense, especially if it can be done, and it can be done, environmentally responsible. So it's, it does not make sense, and at all.
Well, and I mean, in terms of, we've talked a bit about LNG. I mean, in terms of emissions, they went down radically in the US, ironically, under Trump in the first term. And so again, it's always about whether your goal is actually to lower emissions or if it's derangement syndrome over fossil fuels. And if it's fossil fuel derangement, then of course you hate natural gas. And it's just, we've talked about Saguenay and so on, which was a combination of local pushback around the LNG facility, Bill C-69, federal pushback, and it's similar around on the natural gas, topic or umbrella as a whole. It's rife with hypocrisy. It's certainly not good for the Federation. It's not good for energy security, and actually not good for the environment, because it's a cleaner bridge than a lot of things. And even in Germany, and we've talked about that, where they were reliant on energy from Russia, because they suddenly found themselves in a quandary. They had to fire up coal again. It's just, you have to be realistic. And the fact that we have narrowed ourselves so down and excluded ourselves from some of these possibilities and done this to ourselves in so many cases is it's very hard to come back from. And I think that's why, you circled back to these points that were made at CIRA that Sonya heard about, how it's not just an instant thing to drill, baby, drill on any front. It takes quite a lot of groundwork to get it all going again, and a whole political will, in this case, a harmonized one in Canada, to really set a different course. And so I think that's what we're seeing. It's sad.
Yeah.
So we got to wrap up here pretty quick here, folks. Jay Rydell pointed out that they don't want our what was this comment here? They won't let us build pipelines. Maybe they shouldn't get our transfer payments. That's been a long discussion. I know both of you fought that battle for years.
Well, and it's ironic on energy, right? Because when we were talking about counter tariffs, and line 9, and when there was a realization that, it might actually affect, Quebec, then suddenly it becomes a little bit of a different conversation, even Ontario, and ironically, equalization. Because of course it's the biggest generator of money really for the country when it gets into exports and so on. And that generates money for all, which generates interprovincially funding also. So we're in this together. I just don't see why we never quite realized that.
I think we won't have time to answer that last comment here. We're pushing 90 minutes. Sonya, this has been spectacular. I'd like to ask you to come on again sometime, maybe 6 months or a year from now, if you're a willing victim.
Always great to work with Bronwyn. We did so much collaboration together as energy ministers.
So, folks, I see we have 90 people watching right now. I really appreciate you coming online. In future episodes, we're talking, we'll hopefully be getting the Minister of Energy for Saskatchewan, Colleen Young, probably a little bit into session. We were looking at that sooner, but apparently there's some stuff coming out in the budget tomorrow that we might want to watch for that'll affect Saskatchewan. Also, I'm in the works of having a conversation with the CEO of the Arctic Gateway, the people behind the Churchill. We didn't get chance to talk about Churchill here, but one of the big questions is that can we ship oil out of Churchill and maybe potash and other things? So that's another podcast to watch for. We're really trying to get into the weeds some of this stuff, folks, and this is our 5th episode, and I think it's the best one we've had so far. And keep on coming back. We're roughly every 2 weeks. So thank you very much. Sonya, if you just want to stay on for a second here. Bronwyn, is there anything you want to say goodbye? And Sonya?
Yeah, no, just always a pleasure. And next time we'll talk to you also about C-59.
Yes.
So maybe sooner rather than later.
Yes.
Well, hopefully C-59 is gone by then.
Gone.
Oh.
Repealed.
Been fighting that one hard. All right. Thank you, folks. And see you again, hopefully in about 2 weeks.